The world watches with bated breath as two of the Middle East's most powerful nations, Iran and Israel, exchange devastating blows. For many, this direct confrontation seems like a sudden and terrifying escalation. However, the roots of this conflict are deep, stretching back decades. It is a story of how two nations, once quiet partners, became sworn enemies. Before 1979, the relationship was surprisingly different. Iran, under the rule of the Shah, and Israel shared common interests. They saw the Arab nations around them as a mutual threat and quietly cooperated on military and intelligence matters, finding common ground in a turbulent region. This era of cooperation came to a sudden and dramatic end with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The Shah was overthrown, and the Islamic Republic of Iran was born under Ayatollah Khomeini. The new leadership had a completely different view of the world. It saw Israel not as a potential partner, but as an illegitimate state and an extension of American influence in the Middle East. The new regime in Tehran adopted a fiercely anti-Israel stance, calling for its destruction. This ideological shift transformed the political landscape of the region and planted the seeds of the bitter rivalry we see today. In the years that followed, this animosity festered, largely through a so-called shadow war. Instead of fighting directly, Iran began supporting militant groups that shared its goal of opposing Israel. Groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine received funding, training, and weapons from Tehran. They became Iran's proxies, fighting Israel on its borders and launching attacks that kept the region in a constant state of tension. For Israel, this proxy warfare was an ever-present threat to its security, a challenge it consistently sought to neutralize through military operations and intelligence gathering. At the same time, another dangerous dimension was added to the conflict: Iran's nuclear program. Israel, widely believed to possess its own undeclared nuclear arsenal, viewed the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat. It could not accept a scenario where its greatest enemy held the ultimate weapon. In response, Israel allegedly engaged in a campaign of sabotage and assassinations, targeting Iranian nuclear facilities and scientists. These covert actions were meant to slow down Iran's progress, but they also dramatically raised the stakes, turning the shadow war into a high-stakes gamble with potentially catastrophic consequences. For years, the conflict between Iran and Israel was fought in the shadows, a deadly game of spies, sabotage, and proxy battles. But in the early summer of 2025, that all changed. The shadow war burst into the open, becoming a direct and violent confrontation that has shocked the world. The trigger was a series of precise and devastating Israeli airstrikes. These were not small, covert operations. They were a bold and open assault on the heart of Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure. The attacks targeted sensitive sites near Natanz and Isfahan, and in a major escalation, also killed several high-ranking Iranian generals and nuclear scientists. The response from Tehran was swift and unprecedented. For the first time in its history, the Islamic Republic launched a direct military attack on Israeli territory. Hundreds of drones and powerful long-range ballistic missiles were fired towards major Israeli cities and military bases. This was a clear message. The old rules of engagement were over. Iran was no longer willing to fight only through its proxies. It was now prepared to strike Israel directly, risking an all-out war. The spectacle of Iranian missiles flying towards Tel Aviv and the sound of air raid sirens wailing across Israel marked a terrifying new chapter in this long and bitter conflict. The days that followed have seen a relentless cycle of attack and counterattack. Israel has retaliated with its own waves of strikes, claiming to have hit over 40 targets inside Iran, from weapons factories to centrifuge production facilities. Iranian cities like Tehran and Karaj have felt the force of these attacks, with reports of significant damage and civilian casualties. The Iranian people, who have already endured so much, now face the terror of aerial bombardment. Meanwhile, Israel's sophisticated air defense systems like the famed Iron Dome have been working overtime to intercept the volleys of missiles Iran continues to launch. The human cost of this new war is already tragically high and continues to climb. In Iran, reports indicate that hundreds have been killed, including innocent women and children, with many more wounded. One particularly heartbreaking incident saw an Israeli strike in Najafabad kill 6 people, including a pregnant woman. In Israel, though its defenses have intercepted many attacks, Iranian missiles have still found their targets, killing over 20 people and bringing the horror of direct warfare to a population that has not experienced it in this way before. This brutal exchange of fire has shattered any illusion of containment and pushed the entire region towards a precipice. As the conflict between Iran and Israel spirals, the involvement of the United States has become a critical and dangerous element. America has long been Israel's most powerful ally, providing it with financial and military support. This close relationship means that a war involving Israel is almost certain to draw Washington in. From the outset of the June 2025 hostilities, the U.S. has provided support, with President Trump publicly thanking his American counterpart for helping to defend Israel's skies. But what began as indirect support has quickly escalated into something far more perilous for American forces stationed in the volatile region. The situation took a grave turn when an Iranian drone in a brazen attack struck a U.S. destroyer operating in the waters near Bahrain. The strike was deadly, killing 3 American sailors and marking a direct act of aggression against the United States. This single event transformed the American role from a supportive ally to a direct participant. President Donald Trump immediately declared the attack an act of war and authorized retaliatory strikes against Iranian Revolutionary Guard targets in Syria and Iraq. This response, while measured, has placed American and Iranian forces in direct military opposition, a scenario long feared by international observers. In response to the escalating danger, the United States has begun a significant military mobilization. Powerful carrier strike groups, led by warships like the USS Nimitz, have been deployed to the eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. American air bases across the region, from Qatar to the United Arab Emirates, have been placed on high alert, ready for action at a moment's notice. U.S. embassies have gone into lockdown, bracing for potential attacks. These moves are intended as a show of force to deter further Iranian aggression, but they also place a massive amount of military hardware and personnel on a hair trigger, where a single miscalculation could lead to a full-blown war. The rhetoric from both sides has become increasingly inflammatory, pushing the situation closer to the brink. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, has issued a stark warning that any further U.S. intervention will have irreparable consequences, while his foreign ministry has stated that American involvement is a recipe for an all-out regional war. In Washington, President Trump has kept the world guessing with his unpredictable statements, hinting at further military action by saying, "I may do it, I may not do it." This dangerous war of words combined with direct military clashes has created a powder keg where the United States could find itself fully embroiled in a major Middle Eastern war. The conflict between Iran and Israel is not happening in a vacuum. It's unfolding within a complex web of global alliances and rivalries, and with every missile fired, there's a real risk of dragging other nations into the vortex. The most immediate danger, honestly, is a regional spillover. Iran's powerful proxy, Hezbollah, has already started launching rockets into northern Israel from Lebanon, opening up a second front. Over in Yemen, the Houthi movement has begun attacking ships in the Red Sea, claiming they're linked to Israel. These actions are widening the battlefield and threatening to transform the conflict into a multi-front regional war that would be much harder to control. Beyond the immediate region, the world's great powers are watching with intense concern, and their involvement could turn a regional war into a global one. Russia, which has a strategic agreement with Iran, has called for calm, but has also offered to mediate, reminding the world of its influence in Tehran. China, another key partner for Iran, has also supported calls for a ceasefire at the United Nations. If the United States were to launch a full-scale war against Iran, it's highly likely that Russia and China would provide Iran with economic and potentially military support, creating a dangerous standoff between the world's nuclear-armed superpowers. On the other side of the equation, a broader US-led coalition could also form. America's traditional allies in the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, view Iran as their primary rival. They might see an opportunity to join forces with the US and Israel to, perhaps, cripple Iran's military capabilities once and for all. In Europe, the response is more divided. While France is pushing for a diplomatic solution, Germany's chancellor has controversially stated that Israel is doing dirty work for all of us, which suggests some support for Israel's actions. If the conflict escalates, NATO could be drawn in through its mutual defense treaties, especially if American forces or bases are seriously attacked. This alignment of nations creates a chilling echo of the alliances that preceded past world wars. A conflict that starts with Iran and Israel could rapidly expand to include the United States, Russia, and China on opposing sides, with dozens of other countries forced to choose. The war would not just be fought with missiles and drones, it would likely involve massive cyber attacks designed to cripple financial systems and infrastructure, and a naval struggle to control vital shipping lanes like the Strait of Hormuz. The stage is, without a doubt, set for a chain reaction that could drag the entire planet into a devastating global conflict. A full-scale war in the Middle East would not only lead to immense human suffering, but would also trigger a global economic catastrophe. The immediate and most dramatic impact, honestly, would be on the price of oil. The Persian Gulf region, where much of the fighting would take place, is home to the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which about 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes every day. If this strait were to be closed by the conflict, the effect on global energy markets would be immediate and severe. Some analysts predict that the price of oil could skyrocket to over $300 a barrel, a level that would cripple economies around the world. This unprecedented oil price shock would unleash a tidal wave of inflation across the globe. The cost of petrol would soar, making transport for businesses and individuals prohibitively expensive. This would drive up the price of almost every product, from food delivered to supermarkets to goods manufactured in factories. Central banks would be forced to raise interest rates to fight inflation, but this would risk tipping already fragile economies into a deep recession. Stock markets would likely crash as investors panic, wiping out trillions of dollars in wealth and shattering both consumer and business confidence, potentially sparking a depression even worse than that of the 1930s. The economic chaos would extend far beyond energy markets. Global supply chains, already strained in recent years, would collapse. The conflict would disrupt major shipping routes, not just for oil but for all kinds of goods, from electronics and cars to clothing and medicine. This would lead to widespread shortages of essential products, further fueling inflation and causing immense hardship for ordinary people. The price of basic foodstuffs could triple, leading to food crises and social unrest in poorer nations that are heavily dependent on imports. Currencies would become volatile, and international trade would grind to a halt. This economic turmoil would inevitably lead to massive social and political instability around the world. Governments would struggle to cope with soaring unemployment, collapsing public services, and widespread public anger. Riots and protests could erupt in cities from Paris to Jakarta as people struggle to afford food and fuel. The extreme economic pressure could cause governments to fall and might empower extremist political movements that thrive on chaos and fear. In this way, a war that begins in the Middle East would not stay there. Its economic shockwaves would destabilize nations across the planet, creating a cycle of crisis and conflict. In the midst of the terrifying escalation and the dark predictions of a wider war, it is crucial to remember that the future is not yet written. History is made by the choices of leaders, and even on the brink of catastrophe, the path of diplomacy remains open. Behind the scenes of the frightening headlines, frantic efforts are underway to pull the world back from the edge. The international community has not stood by silently. The United Nations, at the urgent request of Iran and its supporters, is preparing to hold an Emergency Security Council meeting to address the crisis. The goal is to find a way to de-escalate the fighting and establish a ceasefire. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has voiced his profound alarm at the situation, pleading with both sides to step back immediately and end the violence. Other nations are also stepping forward to try and mediate. Russia's President Putin, citing his country's strategic ties with Iran, has repeatedly offered to help broker a solution. Turkey's President Erdogan, despite his harsh condemnation of Israel's actions, has also put his country forward as a potential peacemaker. Even in Europe, nations like France are working to build a coalition for a negotiated settlement, arguing that a military solution would be a strategic disaster for everyone involved. These diplomatic efforts face enormous obstacles. The anger and mistrust between Iran and Israel are at an all-time high, and powerful voices on both sides are calling for continued military action rather than compromise. The direct involvement of the United States further complicates the picture, as any diplomatic solution will have to address the concerns of Washington as well. Finding common ground will require immense political courage and a willingness from all parties to step away from their maximum demands. It is a monumental task, but it is the only alternative to a war that could have unimaginable consequences for the entire world. This is a moment of truth not just for the leaders of Iran, Israel, and the United States, but for all of us. The story of this conflict should serve as a stark reminder of how quickly regional tensions can spiral into a global crisis. It highlights the fragility of our interconnected world and the catastrophic price of war. The hope is that reason will prevail over rage, and that the leaders involved will have the wisdom to choose the difficult path of peace over the easy descent into a conflict that could become the Third World War. The fate of millions and perhaps the stability of the world itself hangs in the balance.